Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. The Future Trends Forum is a project that comes out of a research effort of mine called Future Trends in Technology and Education. This is a research project which constitutes a monthly trends report looking at the horizon to see what kind of technology and education changes are occurring. Been running this for a few years. We have enough time and information to form a longitudinal analysis. If you haven't seen it before, please go to that URL, ftte.us, and sign up. Take a look at some reports. Next slide, please. I just want to thank NYSERNet. NYSERNet from New York State has been generously supporting Future Trends, and we're very grateful for their support. Thank you. Next slide. And I'd also like to thank Shindig, because as you can see, they're providing the video conference environment we are currently using. Also, behind this, they're supplying superb human help to make sure that everything flows smoothly. We're very grateful to Shindig for their support. Now, today's guest is a dear friend of mine, Gardner Campbell. If you don't know Gardner, let me just try a quick riff of an introduction. As you can see here from this slide, we call him the visionary innovator, which is a good start of a way of describing him. You can also see that he's currently listed as the Vice Provost for Learning, Innovation, and Student Success at Virginia Commonwealth University, and that's also true. But you have to look back in time. You have to look back over the past 20 years to see that not only is Gardner a recovering DJ, not only is he a leading Milton expert, both as a scholar and teacher, but when it comes to technology and education, he's been on the bleeding edge for more than a decade. This is a man who got into podcasts, social media, DIYU before almost anybody else, not only as a practitioner, but as a leader, helping other people do it, writing, speaking, making other media about it. So you can see from the bottom of the slide, one major link, which is to Gardner's blog that I strongly recommend, a very long-running, very eloquent blog, and also some more information there from his EDUCAUSE profile. If you don't already stalk Gardner through social media, you're missing out. Get on it. Now, what we'll be talking about today are a few really powerful subjects, and I think you will all be interested to hear them. We're going to take a look at, in particular, what happens to student success in the digital ecosystem, and I think we'll start off with that. Shindig folks, can you bring Gardner up on stage? One of the topics I'm going to talk about is what student success means in a digital ecosystem. Gardner, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Beautifully. Beautifully.
Excellent.
Is that Doug Engelbart behind you?
It is indeed Doug Engelbart.
Excellent. Excellent. Founder of the Mouse, innovator of the Windows platform, major heroic figure for our age. Welcome, Gardner. Glad to see you.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity for some conversation. I'm looking forward to having some ideas bubbling around.
Well, let's start the bubbling, percolating. To begin with, you wanted to start talking about what student success means in a digital ecosystem. Can you describe first what you mean by the digital ecosystem? I assume you're not just talking about the campus IT environment.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about varieties of open, participatory, connected learning. And I use those three adjectives, not serially, but there's a combination that happens when you're really in the middle of that network of learning. It's a digital ecosystem that has multiple gardeners, if I can be pardoned that term. It's what I would call a digital commons. Now, this is a little bit different from what we might think of as all the apps on my smartphone. It's a digital commons that I believe we all have a stake in, should recognize the stake we have in it, and be contributors to that digital commons, as well as consumers of what is open now and may increasingly be behind paywalls in the future. So the digital ecosystem, let's say, to sum it up, is open, participatory, connected. It's a digital commons. It is something that we are all nourished by and must contribute to.
That's a much broader sense than is often described. That's the second part of your formulation. The first is student success. Now, given that formulation, what does student success mean in this open, connected, participatory commons?
I'll start with what I take to be the lowest common denominator definition of student success. I'm sorry to say I think it's also the most prevalent definition for student success. So you got that lowest common denominator, most prevalent. And it is retention and graduation, a set of institutional outputs. What that means from the point of view of the individual learner is success in coursework. But success in coursework means you pass the classes, you go to the next class, you advance through whatever the curriculum is, and your success registers on the institutional dashboard, let's say, with numbers retained and numbers graduated, ideally graduated within 4 years. This is not simply a matter of getting people out in a timely manner. It's actually a way to allocate institutional resources. The longer students stay in a particular learning environment, the more difficult it is for people coming into that environment to be able to participate in essentially a limited set of resources. But the effect of that lowest common denominator is pernicious. Whenever you are in a system in which essentially institutional outputs or single individual private goods, the degree you earn, become so fatally interwoven, you get into a very strange situation in which the success of the individual is defined in terms of institutional outputs. The need for institutional outputs drive the definition of what the success is for each of the students. And as we've seen, sadly, again and again, the measures of success become corrupted, because in the end, there are all sorts of ways to assure that people are successful in their coursework, everything from mandatory supplemental instruction, a kind of study hall for 18 to 21-year-olds and above, to, frankly, grade inflation, teachers who are deathly afraid of anything lower than a B or a C, because then that gums up the student success works. I almost said machinery. Clearly, in a digital ecosystem, we're talking about shared private goods that contribute to a public good. That is what we need to emphasize if we're going to have meaningful civic engagement in this medium in the years to come. If we don't, we're not going to be in very good shape as a polis, as a democracy, and we won't have what I think of as true, deep, lasting student success, which is effective participation in this digital commons, or in the largest commons of all, civilization.
Well, Gardner, this is, I don't know if you can tell, I'm trying very, very hard to take notes while poking the chat box and monitoring Twitter. So if you're hearing clicking, it's partly that, but it's also partly the ideas ticking over in my brain. One of them is that this is not going in the direction that I was guessing. I thought that you would be talking about, say, for example, the reduction of student success to not just grades, but also to money, where we measure student success by, does a student get a job? Is a job well-paying? If not to both, then the student is a failure, the institution is a failure. But you're offering a very different approach, where you're talking about, in a way, subsuming the student to the good of the institution.
Yeah, I think that's really where the talk about student success begins, although I should emphasize that no institution will ever define student success in terms of institutional success. That would be very difficult for people to admit to themselves, much less to articulate. And of course, people believe, just as we used to believe, if it's good for General Motors, it's good for the country, that if the retention and graduation markers in a particular institution are high, or where we want them, that must therefore mean that we're doing something right in terms of the student's own good. And I hasten to add that that can be true. No doubt often it is true, but I do think that institutions tend, and this is not just higher ed, it's anything from NASA to your local SPCA, you tend to define your success as an institution in terms of the fact that you've been sustained as an institution. As one of my mentors said to me, if nobody shut you down, you must be succeeding. So there's a chain of mutual dependencies around this idea of success. And then the problem in higher ed becomes, like the US Mint, we make our own currency. We're the ones who assign these grades, we're the ones who define what success means, and we're the ones who can double down on various measures of success that may have very little to do with deep learning, with transfer across domains, and nothing at all to do with the digital ecosystem, which by and large higher education has turned its back on for decades. It may simply have to do with the fact that we made the sidewalks, we made the feedlots, we made the chutes. They started here, they ended there. There was much rejoicing. I should say, though, to your point about earning money, this I don't know, we can talk about this, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that there's an interesting calculus at play here, because many times institutions will resist the kind of indexing to specific forms of student success. For instance, what was the first job you got after you left? How much did that job pay? Because internally it becomes a great political battle, with the humanities suffering mightily in that comparison, and the STEM disciplines usually making out much better, especially if you're in the fabled E category. And I think because of those internal politics, and because there are a lot of humanities faculty who have strong voices within institutions, there's an institutional reluctance that is articulated as a principled reluctance, and it is, in part, to tie student success outcomes merely to financial gain upon graduation. But make no mistake, there is also this other, and I think inimical force that says institutional success indicates student success. We'll tell you exactly what that is and how that looks. And then those target numbers become triggers for various other kinds of, at worst, corruption, at best, misleading and very limited ideas of student success. And I'll add very quickly that the digital ecosystem is rejected by much of higher ed, partly because we can't just mint our own money in that medium. If you're in open, connected, participatory culture, we have a whole host of voices out there that may not give a tinker's cuss for the comma splice because it was an interesting blog post, and may not be at all interested in a very well-polished 5-paragraph essay posted as if it's a blog post that would nevertheless get a kind of a good student certification from a writing teacher.
Gardner, I'm struck by your use of money, not just the literal part that we began with, but also the metaphorical aspect. We mint our own currency. I was going to ask you a bit more about that, but in the chat box, Chris Laud offers this pithy observation, quote, right now, success in most academic institutions is the worst kind of script in a declining company town, unquote. Do you want to riff on that as a response?
Yeah, this is really a very difficult conundrum, and I don't have an answer, but I know that currency represents faith. It represents trust, and thus it's susceptible to very odd and troubling forms of corruption. There's no way to, I would say, objectively assess the value of a college degree or of a particular college course. There's no way to do a pre-test and a post-test that will give you, I think, a reliable indicator of what's happened or what long-term effects it might have. We do need to do assessment. We do need to have some indicator at some point of how well the student has done. And traditionally, that has been the realm of the faculty member, him or herself, an expert, and exercising their judgment in a congenial environment about the particular excellence of a piece of work that the learner has done. What's happened, however, is that that environment has become less and less congenial to the idea of expertise offering judgment on individual learners' pieces of work. That's been for a couple of reasons. One is we've had to scale up massively over the last century, and we have no good way within higher education as a closed community to scale up without beginning to devalue that currency that I'm talking about. The expert guiding the learner becomes more and more detached from that essential relationship. More of the assessment becomes transactional. We begin to speak of dashboards where we want to simplify the number of dials and so forth. Also, external audiences begin to intrude in ways that are not congenial, probably because we've begun to lose some trust. For example, boards of visitors, boards of regents, and so forth. Inevitably, we try to find indicators that can be understood very quickly by a group of concerned yet busy and distracted people who need to know within 45 minutes, 4 times a year, how are we doing? And that inevitably leads to certain oversimplifications, sometimes engaged in with the best of intentions. But you begin to debase the currency because the complexity goes down. And then I think the other thing that we have to take into account is that, and this is my riff on Clark Kerr, the uses of the university, there are certain kinds of divisions, conflicts, etc., that arose once the big business of scientific research began as part of the R&D infrastructure of the nation. In a way, it's very good that the nation decided, or some thinkers in the nation decided, that most of that STEM R&D would take place in a nonprofit environment in our colleges and universities. However, it did create what C.P. Snow famously referred to as the two cultures, separated not so much by ideology, which is what most people think, but by the level and character of the funding. So what happens then, as this currency begins to degenerate even more, is that the university stops being a university. There is no longer an opportunity for conversation at the same depth about value and about rigor. And at the same time, you get people who would really rather not teach gen ed courses, would really rather not teach anybody but majors, because that's going to be connected with their own research. This then gets adopted as a practice by people in the humanities. Not to say that humanities research is not valuable. I have committed scholarship myself, repeatedly. However, inevitably, the institutional support becomes geared towards sources of funding. Funding is measured in terms of research. Humanities will adopt that measure so that they can compete with the sciences. And there becomes less and less time or value for teaching. Then the rear comes up and says, okay, we've got to do something about this, and there's a kind of a patch that's put on it with the so-called scholarship of teaching and learning, with what in fact is a kind of secondary caste of people who are teachers and may be honored as teachers, but there's this split between the teaching and the scholarship, and this idea of committed, institutionally supported expertise begins to decline, and then what do? Well, you need to boost retention and graduation. Let's get on that. Let's inflate the grades if possible. Let's try to diminish the amount of personal contact we have, and besides, we don't have time for that anyway because we've had to scale up. So it becomes an interesting kind of cascade of, to some extent, foreseen and some extent unforeseen consequences. I'm aware that this is a pretty grim picture, by the way.
Oh, welcome to my world. I'd have to say that it seems like you're seeing scaling as a major driver for this. And you date this back to a centuries. I assume you're talking about starting, say, with the growth of land-grant institutions, followed by the GI Bill, followed by the big 1970s boom, and then the generation that we've just lived through, where we've doubled the size of the student population. Scaling really seems to be that big a driver for it.
It is, and there are other factors that get added to that, of course. Part of what drives the scaling is this insistent drumbeat, which so far is supported by data, that you'll earn $1 million more over the course of your life if you go to college than if you don't. And all of the labor jobs are drying up as they're either outsourced to other countries, or I think this is the real fact of the matter, and nobody seems to quite grasp aside from a few columnists. This stuff will be automated. Anything that can be done by a machine will eventually be done by a machine of increasing sophistication. If it's repetitive, if it's mechanical, if it involves heavy lifting under hazardous conditions. I'm not even sure that we would want to build a world where human beings would be subject to those conditions. But those are good jobs. They're honorable jobs. They're jobs that used to require a high school diploma, if that. My father was a laborer all his life, most of the time on the railroad, some of the time in K through 12 institutions. And he did menial, repetitive, mechanical jobs and suffered physically at times because of that. But no, to get out of that, you're going to have a college diploma. And you get the college diploma, and what does that certify exactly? Well, it used to be that a certain kind of personal formation was assumed as part of the duty of higher education, and that's all controversial. I know it's entwined with religious missions of schools and colleges before the rise of the polytechnic institutes. But by abandoning the idea of personal formation in favor of either a polytechnical approach that has to do with specific kinds of workforce preparation, or things that are increasingly kind of scattered around as skills or competencies that you might have as a result of your education, we end up with something that seems to me starts to get quantified in ways that will inevitably lead to a devaluing of the experience. And when that's happened, it's not clear to me that we're going to be able to sustain any of the things that I think most of us who work in higher education continue to treasure. The idea that we are, in some respects, for the good of what will come, a little sequestered, a little abstracted from the daily press of business, afforded an opportunity to consider who we are and what kind of world we would like to build. There is no other sector in society that affords that opportunity, and I fear that higher education just can't find a way to articulate or justify that kind of public good anymore. Public good that arises out of personal experience. And I fear where that will take us. But now back to the scaling issue. We do know that there is a very paradoxical, exhilarating, fraught, and yet successful example of scaling that brings greater personal involvement and engagement. And that's the internet, specifically the World Wide Web, the linked network that's on top of the network. For some reason, the scaling strategies of the internet, innovation from the edges, decentralization, common protocols, a certain kind of personally or intrinsically motivated activity that can nevertheless be shaped for good or for ill by various kinds of community or various kinds of guidance from experts, seems to have been of very little interest to higher education. Instead, we have sold our birthright for a mess of pottage.
Possibly. That's all. The way you describe the internet, in terms of decentralization, innovation from the edges, slightly susceptible to guidance from experts, that describes American higher education as well, because we do not have a federal authority. We have no centralization at all. Our innovation does often come from the edges, move around, and experts have a glancing influence at all. It seems like recognize our double in this sense.
It's an excellent insight. One of the things that really does keep me up at night, that's not a metaphor, is the very tragic irony that we cannot see our own highest principles in the digital world at its best. We help to be the model for that world. I'm aware that there are many problems with the internet, with the web, with security, et cetera, et cetera. I'm aware, though I don't visit, of the really nasty places in Reddit. I'm aware of those things. However, without our strong and self-recognizing presence in those areas, we do our students a grave disservice, and we turn our backs on a model of scaling that we could adopt, adapt, incorporate, be creative within in ways that would benefit our learners and all of us who have them in our charge as well. I keep thinking about this. I think that there are certain aspects of privilege that have gotten in the way of our recognizing our own strengths, and it makes me very sad.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that one better way of assessing student success would be in terms of personal formation. If I'm right about that, what does personal formation mean as a success measure if we imagine an academia deeply involved with the internet, deeply engaged with it? How does personal formation change when we assume that new form of academia?
One of the first indications I had that I was searching for a model of assessment to address your very question was when a librarian, a partner in crime at Baylor University, where I worked a couple of jobs ago, said, "Gardner, what do you want the outcome for your freshman honors seminar in new media to be? What is your learning outcome?" And I was stymied. I don't like to think in terms of learning outcomes. I think that most of the language is reductive, and it drives reductive assessments and vice versa. But I thought, well, I better say something. And so what I said was, I'm looking for an increase in the depth and extent of one's capacity for interest. And it turns out, because my partner in crime librarian was an extraordinary partner in crime, Ellen Filgo, that there are books and many psychological papers out there on the psychology of interest, which is aligned with things like curiosity, other knowledge emotions like awe, and as Paul Sylvia says, confusion is a knowledge emotion. So I would say that one of the outcomes I would seek from the personal formation I'm describing is an increase in the capacity for interest, both in breadth and in depth. One of the things I remember very keenly from learning to read is that suddenly the whole world was talking to me. I thought to myself, I need never be bored again. Because, of course, before I could read, it was just adults' things or a treat I was looking forward to, you know? And then suddenly that literacy gave me access to a conversation across the ages and across everything from my grandfather's popular mechanics magazines with the hovering lawnmowers and the dream interpretation guide at the back of the almanac to things that I wanted to learn about, stereo systems, space travel, whatever else was nearby in the encyclopedias, lives of famous explorers, etc. Now, there are ways to assess an increase in the breadth and depth and capacity for interest. There are certain dispositional markers that we can see, and I think most importantly, there are profound opportunities for learners themselves to demonstrate that increase. I'm talking about what I would call not an e-portfolio, but a beautiful realization of e-portfolio practices. And I say it's that, not an e-portfolio, because as soon as I say e-portfolio, the question is, oh, what do you use? Are you using Digication? Are you using this product? Are you using that product? And the real key here to the kind of personal formation I'm talking about is dispositional. We have a lot of talk about knowledge and skills, but there is a certain disposition towards the world that it seems to me we can encourage, and that would be fairly non-controversial, a capacity for an increased capacity for breadth and depth of interest. As that happens, we start to approach the condition of nothing human is foreign to me, which means that we should have a sounder basis for the conversations we need to have across the polis.
Let me pause you there, Gardner, for a moment, because I think, among other things, if you have written about this recently, an article or blog post, we need to know about that so we can reference it, so we can give people here more to dig into. But I'd also like to give our participants here a chance to talk. And the way we do this is you and I temporarily step off stage and we enter the swarm below, the mingle. And what I would like to ask people to discuss, and this is all of you, discuss with each other, is reflect on what Gardner has just been expounding upon. What does this new form of student success mean if we assume an academia deeply involved, deeply engaged with what the internet has become? How do we try to track for these indices of dispositions that show a willingness to learn? How does that change the work that you do yourself? So reflect on that with each other. Let's take 3 minutes to do this. Gardner and I will jump down and move around with you. And then we'll get back together in about 3 minutes. Shindig, folks, pull us off the stage. Friends, I'm delighted to see all of you mingling. It's a real pleasure to see and hear, in some cases, all of these people talking, comparing notes. I've been remiss in not reminding or mentioning one key feature of the Shindig platform. So it's down there on the very bottom right of the screen. There are 2 orange dots. One has the word raise in a hand like this. If you click that, that sends us and the administrators a signal that you'd like to speak. And then we can bring you up on stage and give you the mic and video, and you can talk to us. If you don't want to do that, or you can't because you don't have a mic or whatever, that's all right. Right next to that button is an orange Ask button. If you click that, it gives us a direct line, and you can type in a question that you'd like to ask, and then I can read that out loud. So in addition to the chat box, you've got the raise hand and the ask, and also Twitter, which is burning up like mad. So why don't we reconvene? What did you guys discover? What are some of your reflections about Gardner's very provocative, appropriately visionary attitudes about the changing of student success in an internet age of academia? So again, you could your thoughts in the chat box, you could raise your hand, you could click the ask button, whichever one you like. I've got a question from Mark Wilson, and what I'd like to do is actually, Shindy, guys, if you can bring the question back up again, please. Mark asks, what are the practices that you consider key for a learning portfolio? How about if we bring Gardner up so he can answer that and respond to it?
I've been brought to the stage.
Back up.
Am I being brought to task?
Oh, you are the task and the mission.
Oh, golly, I'm just going to melt. You talk that way to all your guests, don't you?
Only the best. So, what do you think? What are the practices that you consider key for a learning portfolio? That's from Mark Wilson. Mark, if you want to add, as Gardner responds, if you want to add to that in the chat box, please feel free.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. Thank you. Many things I would include that other people include. Obviously, it's good to have a selection of things the student has made that they're proud of, that they believe represent them well in varied domains of learning and making, to the extent that those two things can be separated. I think it's great to have what you might call an artist's statement, a learner's statement, some kind of reflection to accompany those items that are included, those items that I think should be fundamentally oriented around a multimodal conception of the work that you're going to share. It can be text, it can be sound, it can be images, it can be video, etc. But I think it's also vital that some indication of unscripted connections across the work you're doing be included in that e-portfolio. And let me explain what I mean. One of the saddest things I heard, sad in many respects because I understood exactly where the teacher was coming from, I think, was at a conference in which the teacher said, you know, last year I asked my students to reflect on what they had done and include that reflection as part of the work they submitted. And this year, I'm going to make sure they understand what reflection is. I'm going to give them even more specific instructions on how to reflect. Well, I get it, right? Students are not disposed to reflect in ways that are necessarily deep or that necessarily accord with what we think of as reflection. But I think doubling down on the definition is going to produce compliance. And I want the not true reflection. And most of all, I want space in the e-portfolio for things that are not simply complying. And I think one extraordinary opportunity is to encourage students to make connections. And by that, I mean hyperlinks on the web across the courses that they are taking, across the students within a course, that the interaction not be defined just in terms of the student interacting with the teacher or many students interacting with the teacher, but the students as a community of learners indicating their interest and the relevance of what they're learning, the way Google historically has measured relevance by the frequency and richness of the hyperlinks. There are many other ways to do it as well, but that's one that it seems to me is a very good place to start. And then what you would end up having is a student curating a selection of some of the most important linked learning documentation that they've done over their 4 years. And if it's all working well, the disposition to that kind of unscripted linking should be able to be encouraged in the first year. It should be part of what you are thinking about, in addition to, I go to this class on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8, and then I go to this class at 10, and so forth. You're always looking for those opportunities. And then by the time you're a senior, by the time you're ready to graduate, you've got really ample and interesting documentation of your deliberate activity of linking in unscripted ways across your courses through the entire learning experience. And I think there are ways to visualize that, to be able to make it susceptible of analysis. I think about the Twitter Tags Explorer that Martin Hawksey has put together in the UK, which we used in the Thought Vectors class and have used in some other contexts as well. Something like Twitter, where you can use Martin's mechanism linking user and hashtag across time in a learning experience to basically make a movie of the way the network grows over time, and begin to understand, do I tweet only when there's an assignment, or do I tweet because it's a way of learning? It becomes a practice that I have adopted that won't simply be the result of a teacher saying, do this. When those sorts of things get into e-portfolios, I think you've got something that's going to demonstrate one of the most astonishing workplace skills of all: intrinsic motivation, curiosity, and the diligence to document your own experience in meaningful and productive ways.
That's beautifully, beautifully phrased. And you thought that you were getting to be too grim. I think that's extremely aspirational. Before I get to respond, just wanted to mention that in the chat box, Chris Lawton Autumn have been even gloomier still, writing beautifully. But before I can jump in, Farley's Banner from upstate New York has a hand raised. Shindig folks, can you kick me off and put Farley's in my place?
I hope so.
Oh, I didn't see her. She looks much nicer than I do. Let's try it again. Okay. Well, if we can't bring you up, if there's any issue, please add a couple of notes in the chat box. But we do have another question. Unsurprisingly, we have a lot of questions. And this is from my friend Ted Newcomb. And Ted says, Gardner, it seems like the students have outstripped the teachers in their abilities to use digital affordances. What's going on here?
Another great question. Part of this goes back, I think, to teachers' unwillingness visibly to engage with something electronic that may go wrong. And this goes back even to the electric age. I remember teachers getting quite flummoxed and humiliated when they couldn't make the film strip projector or the movie projector, especially, do what they wanted it to do in my elementary school classrooms. So it's difficult to get a good or reliable indication of exactly what teachers can do or might almost be able to do, because I think there's a certain reticence for the teachers to try in front of the students. But the other thing that I would say is students are very comfortable with digital affordances, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to be part of the digital commons or that they have a stake in the digital commons. They know how to swipe left, swipe right. They know about Yik Yak, they know about Reddit. We should know about those things too and not dismiss them, because there are interesting things that are happening in these environments. Very interesting things. I have a long-standing aspiration of trying to use Reddit in a really meaningful way in some of my own teaching and learning, and I'm sure there are people out there who have done that, and I would very much like to be in conversation with them. But our students don't really understand the digital commons unless they're contributing to it. They're not really going to understand what is available to them in terms of open, participatory, connected learning unless they are making those connections. And I think that this then becomes a source of even greater teacher reluctance, largely because teachers don't have a stake in the digital commons either. And that's sad to me. There's still a great deal of teacher activity, professor activity, let's say, around what I would speak of as kind of we're with my tribe now behaviors. We'll put stuff into academia.edu, though as we know now we shouldn't do that. We'll be in forums that are pretty much segregated we can say to ourselves, well, it won't be of interest to anyone else, and that may well be true, though. Milton for all. But never mind. There are places and times to go with people who are really, your fellow travelers in a particular arena or forum. However, I would wager, I don't know how much, but it might be at least a good $1 or $2 just for the fun of it, that if you took a survey, teachers, professors, how many hyperlinks do you create in an average week? That average would be very close to 0. And I keep going back to hyperlinks because it's the concept of the hyperlink that really is, I think, an overlooked and extraordinarily powerful item in the digital commons. It's certainly how Google tracks interest and relevance, but it also is a marker of one's own ability to connect or one's own determination to make connections visible. It's an easy thing to do, and yet what are you going to do it in a memo? No, probably not. There's nothing sadder than a link that's in a PDF. These things are there. They're transactional. They're informational. They don't do the thing that I think is most important for a hyperlink to do, and that's record an individual's power of analogy, of reason, of connection. So I think that students and faculty, sadly, are pretty much on even ground with hyperlinks and with the structure of the web. My students are losing the ability to report with any degree of accuracy on a URL these days. And I would add, you asked for a publication, Brian. There's a piece that I did in EDUCAUSE Review that came out in the New Horizons column earlier this year. It was the January-February issue on network learning and experiential learning. And that's a place where I do explore some of these ideas.
Thank you. I don't want to rush you, Gardner. Actually, I don't think that's possible. I think you're already moving at such a great clip. We had a couple of more questions. Shindig folks, if you could just pop them up. Mo Peltzel, and please, Mo, if I mispronounce it, I'm very sorry. Asked, students are so conditioned to only create in their digital domains when required to by the profs. How to motivate them further? Thank you, Mo.
So we're back to the question of compliance. If the students cannot be brought into a condition of growing interest, but are responding only to what their instructors have told them to do, then I think we're kind of sunk. But fortunately, there are oblique strategies one can pursue. For example, course site.
Wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Oblique strategies.
Oblique strategies is a deck of cards devised by Peter Schmidt and Brian Eno to help you out of creative jams. So I could talk about that a long time, but in the interest of time, I'll just say start here. Alan Kay says that every interface should be a learning environment. So I would say that one way to help students find their own intrinsic motivation is to make everything connected with the presence of a learning experience on the web as close to a learning environment and as far away from informational transaction as possible. It really is a kind of deep gamification that I'm describing, but it doesn't simply draw on level up. It has to do more with environments that reward clicking around and entice one to click around, what I sometimes call a level 3 link, which is a word that is a hyperlink, but such a strange place for the hyperlink to be that I defy you not to click on it.
Just so you know, Gardner, my little Apple program for taking notes tried to convince me that gamification was really ramification. We have another question. Shindig, folks, if you could bring that up. There's one more question in the queue.
Autocorrect is sometimes a kind of Delphic oracle, at least I choose to believe it.
Yes, or a surrealist dream oracle. While they're bringing that up, let me just note that we're having a high-octane conversation in the chat between Rodney Alden and Chris about the self-awareness of digital natives, about exactly how much they understand about digital affordances. So if you haven't seen that, folks, please keep an eye on it. I have to say we are pressing the last 4 minutes of the hour. So I want to make sure that people have time for more questions rather than me. Mark Wilson has one, a very precise question. He asks about educational metadata. He asks, do you use an educational metadata set on Twitter and elsewhere?
I'll have to ask for clarification. I'm not sure exactly what Mark's referring to, or maybe you can tell me, Brian.
I'm not sure either. Mark, if you want to follow that up in the chat or with another ask so we get some more information on that, it's a great, promising question.
And I note that today I went exploring and found Twitter analytics, which I, of course, because Narcissus loves his reflection, found endlessly fascinating. It's also a business model for Twitter to try to get you to promote what are seen as effective tweets. I also want to talk about the self-awareness for just a minute, because if that chat's raging somewhere, I want to just say one thing about that while we're waiting for clarification around educational metadata. I think students are often shockingly unself-aware about the ways in which they engage the world. I'm not sure that's always a bad thing. I think it's sometimes nice not to know any better because there's a certain openness that can come with that. But I will also say that students are shockingly self-aware in certain kinds of contexts that they will not share with their teachers. Now, it's not just because of the creepy treehouse effect where they have private lives and we don't want to intrude. They do, and we don't. But it has to do, I think, with a lingering suspicion that these kinds of self-awarenesses simply won't count in an academic setting, that they run the risk of being derided or otherwise condescended to on the part of the teacher. And I say this because it happens to me with my colleagues, some of whom will still say things like, oh, Twitter, I don't care what people had for breakfast. Or one of my favorite ones recently, a professor of music, a really fine fellow, said to me, so Gardner, is there a way I can actually have the experience of Twitter without participating? And I said, I don't know. Is there a way that I can have the experience of listening to an orchestra without actually listening to an orchestra? He conceded the justness of my remark, changed the subject, and that was the end of it. So I think there is a way in which the Academy is ruthless in its various signals about what we simply do not deign to have an interest in, and that there are some forms of our students' self-awareness that would conduce to a really vibrant learning environment that they simply choose not to share with us or with each other because they're afraid in the end of being called out somehow.
I think that goes back to scaling. Again, that scaling makes us ever more refined than our participation and our specialization. That gives us even less and less room to pay attention to these. I think we had a question from Scott Robeson. He asks, thoughts on the future of search web being less about finding content and more about finding links, my own or others, between and among content?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, one of the things that happens when you Google something, you know, the results come up in order of relevance, and sometimes Google does try very hard to take you exactly to what you want. But there are other times, yes, many times, when the third or fourth result is going to be Wikipedia, which is almost nothing but links embedded in content. That's why it comes up so often. But I don't know, that's a really, really interesting question. I think whether or not we can do this in Google, we can certainly adopt the practices of what was originally called backrub and be able to build something like Google was in the early days and simply program it to reveal density of meaningful links instead of trying to take us to, this is exactly what you want to buy and you want to buy it right now, which is what, sadly, a lot of Google has become. But there should be a way to do that, to mine and represent density of meaningful connections. And I think we would increase the odds of those connections being meaningful if we took as a kind of corpus the work students are doing as part of their learning.
But we don't right now if we keep it off of the open web.
No, that's correct. I've also heard other things along the lines of, this is pretty much a quote, the only reason there's anything interesting on the internet is that people have put things on there who were trained before there was an internet. It's a sewer and we shouldn't be paying any attention to it. This was a colleague in a political science department, ironically. And it just goes on. I mean, people have a way of shutting down what they simply don't want to have to think about. And because we are very sophisticated thinkers, by and large, in higher ed, we have very sophisticated means of shutting down conversations. And sometimes just calling each other names. That works too.
Oh, this is the worst possible transition statement that I've had for weeks. Speaking of shutting down conversations,
sorry.
We are actually out of time. Here on the Eastern Seaboard, EST time, it's 3 p.m. And this brings us to the end of the hour, which has gone at nearly light speed. We've made this run in several parsecs. Gardner, I've got to quickly dislodge you from the stage so we can put up a slide showing what's happening next time, if you Shindig folks can do that. But don't go away, Gardner, don't go away. Let me, if you can, for a few minutes, please stick around so that we can talk with Chris Lott and a few other folks. Let me just say that next week, next Thursday at this time, we will shift ground to another fine guest, Professor Robert Archibald, who is an economist who specializes in the finances of higher education. He's a co-author of a great book that I strongly recommend with the provocative title of Why Does College Cost So Much? He'll answer that question and point us towards the future of higher education finance next week. I strongly recommend coming. You can find out more about him on that link there. The next slide, please. For more information about Shindig and about future trends, those are two great short links which will take you in the right directions. Let me thank first all the participants who so energetically swarmed and mingled and contributed so much conversation. Let me thank Gardner very much for just a fire hose of ideas. Let me thank the Twitter folks who have been burning up my storify like mad. So we should have a pretty hefty blog post coming off of this right afterwards. I have a few minutes to stick around and talk with you guys. If you do, participants and Gardner, if you would like to stick around, we'll bring you back up on stage and we can keep talking. In the meantime, thank you all so much for coming and contributing. Now, Shindig folks, if you could bring Gardner back up, if he's willing. Too bad, Chris. Gardner, I haven't had a chance to see the chat, but people have been pursuing your thoughts in great detail. Rodney Hargis just added, I was astonished and filled with great joy when 2 years after the class was over, I got an email from a former student inviting me to follow her new blog, which I just thought was nice. Very, very nice.
Great. That's wonderful.
The rest of you guys who would like to come up, Mo or Susan or Sam or Autumn, Rodney, Chrissy, just raise your hand or say something in the chat box and I'll kick myself off and put you up there on stage instead of me. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you very much. It was really good for you to come. Glad to see you.
I should say that I have about 5 or 6 minutes and then another meeting for my sins, but be very happy to stick around for a little bit.
Well, if no one wants to, understood, Ellen, if no one wants to speak on the giant stage of Shindig, we can jump off and pounce on people. Want to do that?
Works for me.
All right, let's do that. Shindig folks, kick us off so we can stalk our audience.